In 2022, the South African Navy, yes, the Navy, had its power cut off because it didn't pay a 3.2 million rand electricity bill. Let that sink in. This isn't just a small government department or a struggling municipality. This is a branch of the armed forces responsible for protecting over 2,800 kilometers of South African coastline. So the question I want you to sit with before we dive into this: if we can't keep the lights on, can we actually defend our borders? Let's talk about how we got here. To understand where we are, we have to understand where we came from. The South African Defence Force, the SADF, was active from 1957 to 1994, and during that time, South Africa built one of the most capable and combat-hardened militaries on the continent. The SADF units fought in the Angolan and Mozambican civil wars. They ran one of the longest border conflicts in African history during the South African Border War. By any conventional measure, this was a strong, serious fighting force. But there's a huge asterisk. A significant part of the capability was built in the service of apartheid, which raises a question we will keep coming back to. What happens when a military is built for the wrong reasons and tries to rebuild itself once again? In 1994, the SANDF inherited everything: the personnel, the equipment, the legacy. But it also had to inherit forces from the Bantustan homeland armies and guerrilla movements such as MK and APLA. These groups were literally trying to shoot the SADF soldiers dead just a few years earlier. Imagine starting a new job and HR tells you that your co-worker is the guy who was trying to kill you last year. That's the process that happened. And overall, this process took about 10 years. Integration was only completed in 2004. But even before it was finished, the slow puncture had already begun. Denel, the state-owned defense manufacturer, started hollowing out. Then came the arms deal, and military spending quietly dropping below 1% of the GDP, a threshold that most defense analysts consider a floor, not a ceiling. Now, I'm not going to name which political party is responsible for this, but someone had to sign those papers. In 1999, the ANC government signed contracts with several European defense companies in what became known as the arms deal, a bid to modernize the Air Force and the Navy. The original financing was for 30 billion rand, but by 2014, the Treasury confirmed the total spending at roughly 40 billion rand after corruption, interest rates, and the crippling of the rand. In plain terms, South Africa bought Ferraris when it could barely maintain an old Citi Golf, and they didn't even service their Ferraris. So the infamous arms deal included purchases of Swedish jets, Italian light utility helicopters, German submarines, and a few other vehicles that I haven't mentioned. If you are wondering when the public actually realized how bad things had gotten, the moment was the Battle of Bangui in March of 2013. South African paratroopers deployed to the Central African Republic, and they were overrun by thousands of rebels. 15 soldiers were killed. They fought with serious courage, but they had no air cover, broken logistics, and outdated equipment. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a live demonstration that the SANDF could no longer project power beyond its own borders. So what actually needs to change? First, the most important thing is a complete shift in the mindset at the top. I'd personally renamed the Department of Defense to the Department of War. But right now, that act doesn't cut it alone. And look, I'm genuinely confused about the Minister of Defense, Minister Angie Motshekga. She went from Minister of Basic Education straight to Minister of Defense. Now, I'm not saying she's incompetent. I'm just saying someone needs to explain the logic to me because I'm not seeing it. But beyond the personnel, here's exactly what needs to change. Reinvesting in denial. A state-owned defense manufacturer is a national security asset, and it means that local jobs, local research and development, and the ability to develop our own surveillance and combat-ready drones without depending on a foreign supplier who can cut you off. And then there's an age problem. The average SANDF soldier is 37 years old, and the target should be between 25 to 30 years old. We've essentially recruited a unit of uncles to defend the South African sovereignty. And South Africa sits at the tip of a continent which controls critical sea lanes, and we share borders with active conflict zones. We have illegal mining armies known as the Zamazamas operating freely inside our own borders right now. And the question isn't whether South Africa can afford a better military. The question is whether it can afford not to have one.